Hello children, welcome back to your science class. Today again we will continue the chapter 4 pollination. We'll study about what is pollination. As you know, flowering plants reproduce by producing seeds. So in order for the seeds to be created, a process called pollination must occur. And first of the topic of this chapter, you read that flower is a reproductive part of plant. So and you know that plants reproduce by its seeds. So pollination is the process by which a flower converts into fruit and that produces the seed. So what is pollination? Pollination is the process in which pollen grains from an anther are transferred to the stigma of the flower. You have read that plant flowers are having male reproductive part, stamen, which have anther, and anther produce that yellow substance called pollen grains, which are male reproductive cell, and flowers are having female reproductive part, that is carpel or pistil, which have female reproductive cell, that is ovule. So the pollination is the process in which these pollen grains from the anther is transferred to the stigma. This process is known as pollination, and you know, after this pollination only, this pollen grains fuses with the ovule and that makes the fruit and converts ovules into seed. So for the formation of seed, pollination is very important. So for pollination, it is important that pollens have to be transferred from anther, means pollens have to reach from anther to the stigma. So this transfer of pollen from anther to stigma is known as pollination. So for pollination to be successful, the pollen grains transferred must be from a flower of the same species. It is also very important. If the pollen grain of any other flower reaches to other flower, so that do not proceed the further process. For pollination, pollen grain must be of the same species, means rose pollen grain should be fall on the rose flower stigma only, then only that will proceed the process and then the seed will form. So for pollination, the pollen grain transferred must be from a flower of the same species. Now there are two types of pollination: self-pollination and cross-pollination. So let's study about self-pollination. Self-pollination is a type of pollination in which the pollens of a flower fall on the stigma of same flower. At the name itself told, self. Self means the flower. In this type of pollination, the anther produces the pollens and that pollens fall on the stigma of the same flower. This takes place in complete flower only. Now you understood that, as you know, that complete flower have all the four parts. So obviously this type of self-pollination will occur only in complete flower, and incomplete flower have only one part, male or female reproductive part. So in incomplete flower, this self-pollination can never be occur. So now I think it is clear. Self-pollination is simple and quick, and as the diagram itself is showing, that pollen grains from the anther is transferring to the stigma of the same flower. See, the pollen grain and a pistil of the same flower collects pollen. So this is self-pollination, and it is a type of pollination is simple and quick. This type of pollination is occur in some plants that are pea plant, peanut, peas, wheat, barley, etc. In these type of plant, that self-pollination is occur. Second type of pollination is cross-pollination. It is more complex than self-pollination. As you know that self-pollination is simple and quick, whereas cross-pollination is more complex. It is a type of pollination in which pollens transfer from anther of one flower to the stigma of different flower, but it should be of same species. As the picture is showing, see here the pollens are transferred from one flower to another flower. This is cross pollination, but the flowers should be of same species. Means like if the rose flower pollen falls on hibiscus flower stigma, that will not take place, continue with the process of pollination. So for pollination, it is important that the transfer of pollen occurs between a same species, and in self-pollination, pollen grains transfer within the same flower, and in cross-pollination, pollen grain transfer from one flower to another flower. So some plants that show cross-pollination are roses, apples, grapes, strawberries, etc. This type of pollination can occur in incomplete flower and complete flower both. Now next topic is agents of pollination. Do you know how these pollens are transferred? Do they have wings? How do they move from anther to the stigma? So there are some agents. The pollen grains get transferred with the help of wind, water, birds, insects, etc. These are known as the agents of pollination. As you have learned that pollen grains are very light, so they can easily flow with the wind. And the water plants, they are producing pollen grains that flow with the water. Some of the plants produce pollens which are transferred by birds like hummingbirds and the insects like bees to the flower, and as they sit on the flower, pollen grains are stuck to their body, and when they visit to another flower, the pollen grain which is stuck to their body may fall on the stigma of that flower. So these works as the agents to help them in pollination. So these are known as the agents of pollination. Now children, what you have learned in whole this chapter pollination, you have learned a flower is a reproductive part of plant. Complete flowers are the flowers which possess all the florals on it, that is sepals, petals, stamens and pistil. Incomplete flowers are the flowers which do not possess any one or more of the four roles. Next, you have learned that monosexual flowers are the flowers which have one of the reproductive structure. Monosexual flowers have either male reproductive part or female reproductive part, and depending on the reproductive part, that can be of a male flower or a female flower. Next, you learned that bisexual flowers are the flowers which have both male and female reproductive structure. They have both stamens and pistil in them. And the hard green leaves like structure near the base of flower are called sepals. Petals are brightly colored part of flower. Androecium, which is made up of stamens, are the male reproductive part of flowers, and that stamen have anther and filament. Anther have pollen grains, which is male reproductive cells. Gynoecium, which is made up of pistils, is known as female reproductive part of flower, and that have stigma, style and ovary, and the ovary produces the ovules, and that ovules are the female reproductive cell. And after fertilization, that ovary converts into fruit and the ovules convert into seed, which produces the new plant. That is why flower is known as reproductive part of plant. Now pollination is the process in which pollen grains from anther are transferred to the stigma of the flower. So in the formation of seeds, first process is pollination. You learn that it is the process in which pollen grains are transferred from anther to the stigma. There are two types of pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is a type of pollination in which the pollens of a flower fall on the stigma of the same flower, whereas in cross-pollination, that involves the transfer of pollen grain from anther of one flower to the stigma of different flower. This is all about flower and the pollination. This is all for today. Now watch the video properly, go through the notes and complete the given assignment. Thank you everyone.